The transport ship drifted down through the clouds of the alien world as the metal hull trembled under the pressure of entry, and inside the crowded cabin cadet Sarah Keene sat in the middle row with her hands gripping the straps of her seat, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the other new recruits. Most of them were alien species she had never seen in real life before, some with scaled skin that shimmered in the dim cabin lights, some with eyes like molten gold, and others with thin tendrils swaying where hair should be. The air inside smelled of metal and something sharp that made her nose sting, and somewhere deep in her stomach a knot was tightening. She had trained for this moment for years, but now that she was here the weight of it felt heavier than any pack she had carried during Earth drills. This was not just a different planet, this was the Intergalactic Military Academy, the hardest and most feared training ground in the galaxy, a place where even the strongest could be broken. Outside the thick glass of the viewing ports, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the academy sprawling across a vast plain of silverstone towers and training fields stretching to the horizon, tall black flags snapping in the wind with the crest of the Zora species, the rulers of this facility. She knew their reputation. They were known for breaking recruits until nothing remained but obedience. The ship touched down with a shudder and the loud hiss of the landing gear settling into the dock. The hatch at the front opened, and a blast of cold air rushed inside, carrying the scent of dust and ozone. The recruits began to file out in rows, their boots clanging against the ramp. Sarah stepped into the open and instantly felt dozens of alien eyes turned toward her. She knew what they saw: a human among warriors bred for battle. They were sizing her up, deciding if she would last a day or a weekend. Some of them already looked sure she would not last at all. The parade ground was massive, lined with towering walls of dark metal banners, fluttering high above the sky, a dull gray with clouds swirling like slow storms. In every direction, armored alien soldiers patrolled the edges of the field, their movements sharp and controlled. But what caught Sarah's attention most was the figure emerging from the far end of the ground. The sound came first, heavy footsteps hitting the stone with a deep thud, each step louder than the last. The crowd of recruits shifted, and a silence fell as the figure drew closer. He was massive, towering over everyone, with thick scaled skin the color of deep iron, his shoulders broad enough to block the wind, his head shaped like the crest of a predator, and his eyes narrow and cold like shards of frozen metal. His uniform was black, trimmed with silver, and across his chest glinted the insignia of a drill sergeant of the Zora species. Sarah had read about them in her mission files, but the reality of seeing one up close made her chest tighten. This was Sergeant Korth, and even among the Zorath, he was known for cruelty. He stopped in front of the new recruits, his gaze sweeping over them with the slow calculation of a hunter scanning prey. His eyes paused when they reached Sarah. He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw shifting slightly, as if holding back a snarl. Then his deep gravel voice rolled out across the field like the grind of stone on stone. "Human you are in my unit. Now you will wish you were not." A ripple of unease moved through the line of recruits, some glancing at her with pity, others with quiet amusement. Sarah kept her back straight and her chin high, refusing to look away from his gaze, but she could feel her heartbeat pounding like a drum in her ears. Korth turned sharply, barking the next order. "Formation now." The recruits scrambled into lines, their boots slamming the ground in unison. Sarah moved quickly, falling into place, but her eyes stayed fixed ahead, determined not to let him see fear. Korth began pacing the line, inspecting each recruit with a glare sharp enough to cut metal. When he passed Sarah again, he slowed for just a fraction, his head tilting as if he was already thinking of ways to test her and maybe ways to break her. The wind howled across the training field, tugging at uniforms and rattling the high flags. The air tasted cold and metallic, the sky above still heavy with swirling clouds. The sound of marching boots echoed as the recruits moved under Korth's orders, but Sarah felt the weight of his presence even when his back was turned. Each step she took was a silent vow. She would not be the human who failed. She would not give him the satisfaction. As the lines formed tighter and the drills began, Sarah knew this was only the first moment of the first day, but it already felt like stepping into the mouth of a predator, and she had no choice but to walk deeper. The training yard was nothing like Sarah had imagined. It was not a clean field or an orderly gym. It was a jagged stretch of black stone under a sky that seemed to press down like a heavy lid. Each corner filled with strange alien equipment. Some machines were made of twisting metal bars that glowed faintly. Others looked like cages with walls that shifted, as if alive. The air carried the scent of dust, sweat, and something metallic that clung to the tongue. The recruits were split into groups and sent to different sections for combat drills. Sergeant Korth's voice cracked through the air like a whip calling orders, with no pause or mercy. The first hour was a blur of strange stretches and exercises under a heavier gravity than Earth. Sarah's legs burned, her lungs ached, and her vision swam, but she refused to slow down. Even when a large insectoid recruit next to her stumbled and collapsed, she pushed harder, her boots scraping over the stone, her breath coming in sharp pulls. Korth's gaze landed on her more than once during the drills, sometimes with what looked like curiosity, other times with the cold amusement of a predator studying how long its prey could run before breaking. When the group rotated to the sparring rings, Korth's voice carried over the yard. Human, step forward. The entire section went silent. Sarah's boots crunched against the ground as she moved to the center of the ring, her mind racing, but her face locked in calm. She knew this was not a test of skill alone. It was a test of spirit. Korth's tall shadow fell over her as he gestured to the side, and another figure stepped forward, a towering alien recruit with thick arms covered in ridged armor plates and a heavy tail dragging behind him. His head was crowned with bone-like spines, his eyes small but glinting with hunger for the fight. Korth spoke again, his voice low but carrying over every ear in the yard. Show her what real warriors are made of. The alien recruit stepped closer, each step deliberate, his tail scraping the stone. Sarah raised her fists, remembering the human combat stances drilled into her muscles. But she also remembered what she had read in the alien manuals. Every species had weak points, and sometimes the largest were the easiest. To reach the ring fell completely silent, save for the distant hum of machinery as the two faced each other. The alien struck, first a quick swipe of a clawed hand aiming for her head. She ducked low, letting it pass just above her hair, and countered with a strike to his side, her knuckles connecting with the joint between two armor ridges. He grunted more from surprise than pain and swung his tail in a sweeping arc. Sarah jumped back, the tip grazing her leg hard enough to send a sharp pain up her thigh. They circled each other again, Sarah focusing on breathing steady. The alien lunged, and she sidestepped, catching his arm and driving her elbow into the joint. This time he staggered a step. Korth's voice cut through the moment. Pathetic, hit her like you mean it. The alien snarled and came at her with a double-handed swing, aiming to crush her, but she stepped into the attack, instead of away, sliding under his guard and striking his jaw with the heel of her palm. The sound echoed sharp in the air. A murmur ran through the watching recruits, and for a heartbeat Sarah thought maybe she had proven her point. Then Korth moved. His massive frame crossed the ring in 3 strides, his clawed hand shooting out faster than she could react. He backhanded her across the face with a force that sent her vision spinning. Her nose exploded in pain, and a warm rush of blood poured down her lips. Her knees buckled, and the world tilted. She caught herself before she fell completely, but the copper taste in her mouth was thick, and her breath came ragged. Korth stood over her, his voice a low growl, meant only for her, yet loud enough that others could hear. Soft world bones break too easy. The blood dripped steadily onto the black stone, the metallic scent mixing with the dust. Her eyes watered, but she forced herself to straighten, to stand tall, her chest rising and falling. With sharp breaths, she locked eyes with him, and though her voice was quiet, it carried across the ring. I am not broken. For a second there was nothing in his expression. Then he turned away, his tail-like coat swaying as he barked for the next drill to begin. Sarah was ordered to remain in the ring and continue sparring as the blood from her broken nose smeared down her chin. Every blow sent fresh shocks of pain to her skull, but she did not fall. She adapted, moving lighter, faster, keeping her guard high. Hours seemed to pass in the haze of movement and pain, every moment a struggle to keep balance in the heavy gravity. By the time Korth finally called the end of the session, Sarah's uniform was streaked with dust and dark stains. Her arms ached, her legs trembled, and her head pounded. Yet she walked out of the ring without a limp. The other recruits whispered as she passed, some with surprise, some with doubt, and a few with the grudging respect of soldiers who had seen endurance that matched their own. In the far corner, she caught the faintest glance from a reptilian recruit who nodded once, a silent gesture that told her she had earned something, even if small. Korth did not speak to her again that day. He simply marked something on his datapad with a clawed finger and moved on to shout at another recruit, but she could feel his gaze lingering when she was not looking, as if he was already planning the next way to break her. When the drills ended, the recruits were given only a few minutes to eat. The mess hall was loud with clattering trays and alien voices in dozens of languages. Sarah sat alone at one of the narrow benches, her nose still aching though the bleeding had slowed. She used the edge of her sleeve to wipe away the last dark smear from her mouth and chewed slowly on the bland protein bar that served as dinner, her mind not on the food, but on the fight replaying. Every movement, every mistake, and every opening she had seen. She thought about the moment he had struck her, the way the world had blurred, and how easy it would have been to stay down. She thought about the pride in his voice when he had called her fragile, and about the heat in her chest when she had refused to give him the satisfaction of fear. In that moment, something had shifted, not just in her, but in how she saw this place. She realized the academy was not just about strength or skill. It was about finding what you would do when the weight of the galaxy pressed down hard enough to crack bone. And like some recruits would break, others would bend, and maybe a few would fight back until they could stand taller than those who tried to crush them. She decided she would be one of those few. As the mess hall emptied and the lights dimmed for lights out, Sarah returned to her bunk, sliding into the narrow bed with the hum of distant machinery filling the silence. Her body ached in every joint, but her mind stayed sharp. She pulled the alien combat manual from under her pillow, the one she had brought from Earth against the rules, and began turning the thin pages, her eyes tracing every diagram, every move she could use. She whispered to herself, so quietly no one could hear, "I will make him regret underestimating me." The cold light above flickered once before going dark, and in the shadows, she kept reading, memorizing the enemy one detail at a time, the pain in her nose a steady reminder that the fight had only begun. The alarm blared long before the first hint of dawn, a deep vibrating sound that seemed to shake the walls of the barracks and rattle through Sarah's bones. She pushed herself out of the narrow bunk, her legs still aching from the previous day, her nose tender, but healing slowly. The cold floor bit at her bare feet as she grabbed her uniform and suited up quickly, every movement a fight against the stiffness in her muscles. The air inside the barracks was cold and heavy with the scent of oil and metal. Sergeant Korth's voice thundered outside before she even reached the door, calling for formation, his tone sharp enough to cut through any lingering sleep. The recruits spilled into the yard, their boots slamming in rhythm. The sky above was still dark, streaked with pale light from the twin moons hanging low on the horizon. The wind carried a fine grit that stung the skin. As Sarah took her place in line, she could feel Korth's eyes moving over the ranks until they settled on her for a brief moment, a silent warning of what was to come. The morning drills began with low oxygen runs, each recruit strapped with a weighted pack heavier than anything Sarah had carried before. The gravity on this world already pressed harder than Earth's, and the lack of oxygen made every breath burn like fire in her lungs. The path wound through jagged rock outcroppings and uneven ground. The recruits pushing forward under Korth's constant shouts. Sarah kept her pace, steady, her vision narrowing to the boots in front of her, the sound of her breath and the pounding of her heart. She refused to fall behind, no matter how much her chest screamed for air. Halfway through the run, one of the smaller alien recruits collapsed, gasping on the ground. Korth did not slow. He ordered two others to drag the fallen recruit to the side and bark for the rest to keep moving. Sarah's legs felt like they were turning to stone, but she pushed harder, each step a silent act of defiance against the doubt she saw in the eyes around her. By the time they reached the end of the circuit, sweat soaked her uniform, her pack digging painfully into her shoulders, her breaths coming in ragged pulls. There was no rest. The next drill began immediately, weapon handling under a gravity overload. The recruits strapped into heavy suits that amplified the already crushing weight. Every movement became slow and deliberate, as if pushing through water. Sarah's arms trembled as she lifted the training rifle over and over, her fingers numb from the strain. The suit servos whining with each motion. Korth moved among them, his gaze sharp and his words cutting. He stopped behind Sarah, watching her struggle with the weapon. "Weak grip," he said in a voice low, but meant to be heard by everyone around. "Adjust or fail." Sarah bit back the sharp retort that rose in her throat. She shifted her stance, planting her feet wider, tightening her hold on the rifle, and forcing her body to obey. The muscles in her arms burned, but the weapon rose smoothly. This time Korth lingered for a moment, then moved on without another word. Hours passed in a blur of physical trials, everyone harder than the last. The recruits hauled massive weighted crates across the yard in pairs, climbed towering walls with shifting holds, and fought against mechanical opponents that struck with unyielding force. Sarah's hands blistered, her knees scraped raw, her entire body screaming for rest. Still she kept moving. When the sun finally rose high and pale in the sky, Korth ordered combat drills again, pairing recruits for sparring matches. Sarah was placed against a tall reptilian recruit whose scaled skin shimmered green. Under the light, his movements were fast and his strikes precise, each blow sending a jolt through her already exhausted body. She relied on speed and timing to stay in the fight, dodging and countering whenever she saw an opening, but each exchange left her a little slower, her arms heavier, her breath shorter, until the final strike caught her in the ribs hard enough to knock her back against the ring's edge. Korth called the match, his voice carrying no praise, no recognition, only the next order. Return to your position. Sarah obeyed, moving stiffly, her ribs aching with each breath. The rest of the day blurred into more drills, more running, more climbing, until every part of her felt close to breaking. By the time the sun began to sink, the recruits were released to the mess hall. Sarah moved slowly, her tray in hand, taking a seat in the corner away from the loud chatter of the others. She ate without tasting the food, her mind turning over every failure, every small success, every way she could improve. She knew now that pain was not just part of the academy, it was the language of it, and if she wanted to survive, she had to learn to speak it fluently. She could not match the aliens in brute strength, but she could outlast them in focus and adaptation, in the quiet study of every weakness they showed. That night, when the lights dimmed and the barracks grew quiet, Sarah lay on her bunk, staring up at the dark ceiling, the hum of machinery a steady backdrop. Her muscles ached too much to sleep, her nose throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She thought of Korth's eyes, watching her like a predator, waiting for the moment she would break, and she made a decision. She would not wait for his next test. She would prepare for it. She slid silently from her bunk, pulling the alien combat manual from its hiding place beneath the thin mattress. The pages were worn at the edges from her constant reading, but there was more to learn. She studied diagrams of alien anatomy, memorizing the location of vulnerable joints, the timing of certain attacks, the stance that left the least exposed. She traced each movement in her mind, her fingers twitching in silent rehearsal. From across the barracks, she heard the quiet shift of another bunk and looked up to see a fellow human recruit watching her, a young man with sharp eyes and a face set in the same determined lines she saw in her own reflection. He tilted his head toward her book, then toward Korth's quarters. Down the hall, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a way to hit him back when it counts." Sarah met his gaze, her hands tightening on the edge of the manual. He leaned closer, his words quick and quiet, drowned out by the steady hum of the facility systems. He spoke of the upcoming commander's inspection, the one day when every drill sergeant was required to spar a recruit in front of the academy's highest authority. A fight they were meant to win, but also meant to show the skill of their students. He told her it was the perfect chance. As his words sank in, Sarah felt the weight of her exhaustion lift, just a fraction, replaced by something sharper, a small fire kindling deep inside. She closed the manual and slid it back under her bunk. The plan was simple on the surface, but it would require patience and precision, and every bit of strength she could build between now and that day. Lying back in her bunk, she let the idea settle in her mind, the image of Korth stumbling the same way she had, the sound of a crowd reacting, the shift in power it could bring. Her ribs still ached, her nose still hurt, and her muscles still trembled, but beneath all of that there was the steady beat of determination. She was not broken, and she would not break, not until she had taken her shot and made it count. The days that followed passed like a storm that never ended. Each morning began with the blare of the alarm and the cold rush of air as the recruits ran to the yard under a sky the color of steel. Sarah's body was sore in every muscle, her ribs still tender, but she carried herself with a steady focus. She was counting each sunrise, because every one brought her closer to the commander's inspection. The one day she could strike back, the one day she could do it in front of every eye that mattered. Korth's training only grew harsher, the runs longer, the weights heavier, the gravity training more crushing. He seemed to watch her with a sharper edge, now testing her endurance in ways that broke other recruits. One by one, some collapsed during drills and were sent away for medical leave, others failed the obstacle courses and were reassigned to less demanding units. Sarah refused to be among them. She kept her breathing steady, her movements controlled even when her vision blurred and her legs felt like they were filled with lead. The gauntlet was announced without warning one morning, a trial so brutal that recruits spoke of it in hushed tones. It was a live combat obstacle course filled with traps, moving walls, and ambush points where mechanical and live opponents would strike without mercy. The rules were simple: make it to the end or be carried out. Sarah knew Korth would be watching her more closely here than anywhere else, so she chose her position carefully. When the lineup formed, she stepped into the slowest slot near the rear, letting the stronger and more aggressive recruits charge ahead. She wanted Korth to think she would be easy to follow, easy to break. The whistle sounded, and the first section came alive, the ground shifting under their boots as platforms slid apart, revealing sudden gaps. Sarah leapt across each one with precision, her mind mapping the course. As she moved ahead, a wall slammed down in front of her, and she ducked into a crawl space, emerging into a narrow path lined with swinging metal arms. She darted through them, letting the heavy gravity pull her low, her breathing sharp but steady. Halfway through the gauntlet, she caught sight of Korth standing on an observation platform, his massive arms folded, his gaze fixed directly on her. She forced herself to move with a balance of speed and caution, not wasting energy, but not falling behind. She passed one alien recruit struggling against a net trap, slicing the bindings with the small training blade they were issued, and moving on without looking back. The sounds of shouts and impacts filled the air, but she kept her focus forward. The final section was the most dangerous, a series of platforms suspended over a pit of shifting metal shards. The platforms swayed with every step, the shards below grinding together like the teeth of some ancient beast. Sarah stepped lightly, using her smaller frame to keep balance, her arms spread for stability. As she moved faster, the platforms clanged under the weight of larger recruits behind her, but she kept her pace until the last jump brought her to solid ground. She landed with a sharp exhale and crossed the finish ahead of most. Despite her slow start, she did not look toward Korth, but she felt the weight of his gaze like a hand pressing between her shoulders. There had been no stumble, no sign of weakness for him to seize on, and that was enough. For now, later in the barracks, she overheard two alien recruits talking in low voices, one of them saying the human might actually survive the season. She let the words sink in, but did not smile. Instead, she went to her bunk, pulled out the combat manual, and began reviewing everything she knew about Zorith fighting styles. The next days were filled with more drills, more sparring, more grueling endurance runs, and through it all, Sarah trained her mind as much as her body. She memorized the way Korth shifted his weight before a strike, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he committed fully to an attack, the way his left side was always just a little slower than his right. She practiced her footwork during every break, rehearsing combinations that could exploit those openings without making it obvious. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the academy walls, casting long shadows across the yard, Sarah was approached by the same human recruit who had spoken to her before. He said the commander's inspection was now set for the end of the week, and that Korth was already telling other sergeants he would use the moment to humiliate the human in front of the highest authority. Sarah listened quietly, nodding once, and feeling that fire inside her burn hotter. This was exactly what she wanted him. Confident, arrogant, sure that she could be broken. The day before the inspection, the training was lighter than usual, giving recruits a chance to recover. Sarah used the time not to rest, but to drill herself in the empty corner of the yard, moving through sequences again and again until sweat darkened her uniform. Her arms ached and her legs felt ready to give out. She stopped only when the sky turned black and the call for lights out echoed across the barracks. That night she lay in her bunk, wide awake, her thoughts playing out every possible angle of the coming fight. She imagined the crowd, the commander watching from his high seat, Korth towering over her, ready to end the match. In seconds, she imagined the exact moment she would turn it around. The sound of surprise from the audience, the shift in the room as they saw a human stand against a Zorith and not fall. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing slow, her mind clear. When the morning came, the yard was filled with a different kind of energy. Recruits stood straighter, uniforms sharper, the air buzzing with anticipation. The commander's presence was rare, and everyone wanted to be seen at their best. Sarah stood in line, her eyes fixed forward As the tall figure of the commander arrived, his long cloak trailing behind him, his expression unreadable, he took his seat at the edge of the main combat ring, and the sergeants began presenting their chosen recruits, one by one. Each match short and decisive, the sergeants always winning, but with enough show to impress. When Korth's turn came, his voice rang out clear and cold as he called for the human to step forward. The crowd shifted their attention to her, some with interest, some with doubt. She walked into the ring, her boots steady on the black stone, her eyes meeting Korth's. Without hesitation, he gave the smallest tilt of his head, the look of a predator about to strike. The whistle blew, and the match began. Korth moved with the same precision she had studied for weeks. His first attack, a heavy right aim to knock her off balance, she sidestepped, letting the blow pass close enough to stir the air around her head, and countered with a sharp strike to his exposed side. Not enough to hurt, but enough to test his reaction. He adjusted, quickly pressing forward. With a flurry of blows, she blocked and evaded, keeping her movements tight and economical, the crowd watching intently. She was waiting for the moment she knew would come, the instant his temper slipped and his control faltered. She could already see the edge of it in the narrowing of his eyes, the slight increase in force behind each attack. She kept herself just out of reach, feeding his frustration, until his guard began to open, her heartbeat steady, her breathing smooth, as she prepared to take the opening when it appeared. The ring was silent except for the sound of boots scraping against the black stone. Korth's massive frame casting a shadow over Sarah as he advanced, his scaled hands curling into fists, each step deliberate, his cold eyes never leaving hers. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze. In the yard, the commander seated at the edge, the other sergeants standing near him, the recruits crowded just beyond the barrier. She could hear her own breathing, hear the steady hum of the energy shields around the ring, but most of all she could hear the slow, heavy rhythm of Korth's approach. He struck first, a sweeping blow aimed at her shoulder that would have driven her to the ground if it landed. She ducked low, letting it pass just above her, and stepped to the side, striking his ribs with the edge of her hand. The impact was sharp, but light enough not to draw suspicion. She was not here to win, yet she was here to make him think she was only reacting, only defending. He turned with a low growl, the sound deep and dangerous, his tail sweeping out in a sudden arc. She leapt back, feeling the rush of air as it passed inches from her legs. Korth pressed harder, now a series of quick strikes, each one faster than the last. Sarah blocked with her forearms, absorbing the shock, her muscles screaming, but her stance unbroken. She kept her eyes on his shoulders, watching the way they rolled before each attack, measuring the timing of his steps, the small lag in his left foot that told her when the opening would come. She shifted her weight between strikes, letting him believe he was pushing her back, letting the crowd see what looked like the inevitable. From the corner of her vision, Sarah saw the commander leaning forward, slightly, his expression still unreadable, the other sergeants murmuring quietly to one another. Korth noticed too, and his movements grew sharper, faster, more aggressive. He wanted to end this in a display of overwhelming strength, and that was exactly what she needed. The harder he came at her, the easier it would be to make him overcommit. A heavy downward strike came next, aimed straight for her head. She stepped in closer instead of away, driving her forearm up to block and twisting to push him off balance. It was a small disruption, but enough to make him shift his footing. He snarled low in his throat, his eyes narrowing. She knew the moment was coming, the moment when his control snapped. She could see the flicker of it in his jaw, the tight set of his shoulders. She gave him space, stepping back 3 paces, her chest rising and falling, as if she was struggling to keep up. He took the bait, charging forward with a sudden burst of speed, his right fist pulling back for a blow that would crush her if it connected. But as his weight came down on his forward leg, she moved in a blur, stepping to the side and striking his vulnerable joint with the heel of her boot. His knee buckled for a fraction of a second, and she spun with the momentum, driving her elbow into his ribs hard enough to force a grunt from deep in his chest. The crowd gasped, the sound sharp in the air. Korth's eyes flashed with rage, the kind that burned away precision, leaving only raw power. He swung wildly now, his tail slashing behind him, his claws raking the air. She dodged one strike, then another, her movements flowing in tight arcs, her mind fixed on the final step. She needed one clear opening, one moment when his nose, his most fragile point, was exposed. She had felt the pain of his backhand on her first day, the memory of that crack of bone still alive in her mind. She would return it now in front of them all. She baited him again, feinting a strike to his right side. He shifted to block, leaving his head forward just enough She stepped in fast, her hand snapping up in a tight arc. The heel of her palm, slamming into the bridge of his snout. The sound was a sharp crack that cut through the hum of the shields. His head jerked back, his stance breaking as he stumbled 2 steps. The crowd erupted in shouts, some in shock, some in disbelief. Korth's claws flexed, but he did not strike again. The commander had already raised a hand to halt the match, his voice carrying over the noise. Enough, the point has been made. His gaze moved from Korth to Sarah, lingering for a moment before he nodded slightly, not approval exactly, but recognition. She stepped back, breathing hard, her palms tingling from the force of the blow, her ribs aching from the earlier hits, but she stood straight, her eyes never leaving Korth's. The commander addressed Korth directly. Your training methods produce results even against you. It seems the words were measured, but their weight was clear. The other sergeants exchanged glances, some with thin smiles, others with narrowed eyes. Korth's jaw was tight, his gaze locked on Sarah with something that was not just anger, but something sharper, perhaps respect, perhaps something else entirely. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah stepped out of the ring, her boots heavy on the stone. The human recruit, who had first told her about the inspection, caught her eye from the edge of the yard, giving the smallest nod. She returned it, without a word, her pulse still racing from the fight, the noise of the gathered recruits fading behind her. In the barracks later that evening, the atmosphere was different. Eyes followed her as she moved, some alien recruits muttering under their breath, others openly watching with something like curiosity or even respect. She ignored it, settling onto her bunker, mind replaying every movement of the match, every shift in Korth's stance, every reaction from the commander. She knew the fight was over, but the real change was only beginning. She had not only struck back, she had done it in a way that no one could ignore. When lights out came, she lay in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the other recruits, the distant hum of the academy's machinery, the faint echoes of the day still alive in her mind. She thought of the crack of bone, the sudden silence, the shift in the crowd. She thought of the fire that had carried her through each strike, each dodge, each decision she had made since her first day here, and she knew this was the turning point. She had shown them what a human could do, and she had done it, without breaking, without fear, without bending under the weight of the galaxy pressing down on her shoulders. The path ahead would still be brutal. Korth would not go easier on her. In fact, he might push harder. But now every test would be different. Every glance from the other recruits, every word from the sergeants, shaped by the moment she had taken the chance and made it count. The cold air of the training yard was thick with tension as Sarah stood at the edge of the combat pit, the sound of heavy alien breaths mixing with the low hum of the shield walls that surrounded the arena. The ground beneath her boots was stained with the marks of hundreds of battles, grooves carved by claws, burns left by plasma bursts, and the deep scars of melee strikes. She knew this was not a training session, this was a test, and not just for her strength, but for her will to defy Sergeant Korth and every alien watching. The crowd of recruits pressed against the barrier, their eyes locked on the human standing alone. Some of them whispered in their own tongues, their voices dripping with either doubt or excitement. The air carried the metallic tang of weapons, and sweat, a scent that spoke of violence. Sarah adjusted her stance, her fingers curling into fists. She had no weapon today, no armor beyond the basic training suit, but she had something the others did not, the stubborn fire in her chest that had kept her alive since day one. Across the pit, the gate hissed open, and the figure that stepped out made the ground seem smaller. Korth himself had decided to enter the fight, his scaled skin catching the pale light, his massive form moving with slow, deliberate steps, like a predator approaching the kill. The crowd fell silent as his eyes locked on hers. There was no need for words. His gaze said everything she needed to know. This was about punishment, and about proving a point to everyone else that a human would never rise above the bottom rung of this academy. Sarah's mind flashed back to the moment days ago when his elbow had shattered her nose, the pain, the humiliation, the blood on the training floor, and the way he had smirked after it all. She remembered how she had sworn silently to herself that she would strike back, not in rage, but in precision. She took a slow breath and stepped forward, the cold wind brushing against her face, her muscles coiled and ready. Korth raised one massive hand, curling claws into a loose guard, and then, without warning, he lunged. The first strike came low, sweeping for her legs, but she leapt back, the ground shaking where his claws hit, stone shards flying upward. He moved again, this time faster, his heavy arm swinging toward her head. She ducked under the blow, feeling the rush of air as it passed. She pivoted and drove a quick punch into the side of his ribs. The impact made a dull sound like hitting a slab of metal, but she felt him flinch, just enough to know she had landed the hit. The crowd reacted with a sudden roar, some surprised, some laughing, some jeering, but Korth did not laugh. He straightened, his eyes narrowing, and he charged again, his footfalls like small quakes in the ground. Sarah sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him forward. Then she pivoted and struck his back twice in quick succession, aiming for the joint seams where scales met. Softer flesh. The blows were small compared to his size, but they were fast and precise, and Korth growled low, deep, and angry. The fight became a storm of movement. He swung heavy, and she slipped around his strikes. She darted into hit, then pulled away before he could trap her. His size gave him strength, but her smaller frame gave her speed. Each exchange was like playing with the edge of a blade. One wrong step, and she would be on the ground or worse, but she refused to let him corner her. Her mind stayed sharp, calculating every angle, every step. Then he shifted tactics, dropping low and sweeping both arms in a wide arc. The force caught her mid-run, sending her rolling across the pit. The breath knocked from her lungs. She pushed herself up. Just as a shadow fell over her, he reached down, claws flashing, but she grabbed his wrist, twisting sharply, and using his own weight to drag herself upward, kicking both feet into his chest. The impact sent him staggering one step back, just enough space for her to land on her feet again. The crowd noise swelled, now a mix of shock and disbelief. Some aliens shouting in their languages, others pounding fists against the barriers. Sarah could feel her pulse hammering in her ears, every muscle burning. But she did not back down. Korth's expression shifted slightly, not just anger now, but something close to respect, though it was buried deep under layers of pride. With a sudden roar, he came at her again, this time faster than before, his claws cutting the air inches from her face. She ducked, slid to the side, and swept her leg into his knee. The joint buckled, just enough for her to spring up and drive her elbow hard into the base of his skull. The impact reverberated through her arm, and Korth stumbled forward, catching himself on one knee. The arena fell into a moment of silence, the sound of his heavy breathing filling the space. Sarah took that moment. She closed the distance and landed a final strike, an upward punch under his chin, snapping his head back. His balance wavered, and he fell backward, hitting the ground with a deep thud, dust rising around him. The shield walls flickered slightly as the crowd erupted in chaos, some cheering, some booing, some simply stunned into silence. The image of the massive drill sergeant lying on the ground, while the human cadet stood tall, burned itself into every mind present. Korth lay there for a breathless moment, his eyes opening slowly, and when he rose it was not with the fury she had expected, but with a slow, measured motion. He stood towering over her still, but now his head inclined slightly, his voice low and gravel-edged, but different from before. Not bad human. It was not praise, not exactly, but it was something else, a shift in the way he saw her, perhaps not as we pray anymore, but as someone who had earned at least a fraction of his attention. Sarah nodded. Once no words needed. She had done what she came to do. She had struck back, and in front of everyone. The crowd slowly dispersed under the orders of other drill sergeants, but whispers followed her every step back toward the barracks. She could feel eyes on her, some with newfound respect, others with resentment. Yet she kept walking, her head high, her body aching, but her spirit unbroken. The fight was over, but she knew the war of survival in this academy had only just begun. And somewhere in the shadows of the training ground, Korth was still watching her with those cold eyes. The academy halls felt colder that night as Sarah walked alone, her boots clicking softly against the metal floor, the dim lights above casting long shadows on the walls. Every corridor seemed longer than it should, and each turn felt like it could lead to danger, but she kept walking, her body still aching from the fight, yet her mind alive with the memory of standing over Korth in the arena. She had not just survived, she had changed something in that moment, something small but powerful. In the barracks, whispers followed her every step. Recruits of all species stared, some wide-eyed, some narrowing their gaze in open hostility. A few spoke in hushed voices, saying the human beat the drill sergeant. Others scoffed, saying it was luck, but all of them remembered, and all of them kept watching. She ignored the looks and moved to her bunk, lying down, but she did not sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, her heart still carrying the rhythm of battle and the sound of the crowd. She knew tomorrow would be harder, because now she was no longer invisible. Morning came too quickly, the harsh alarm blaring through the speakers, shaking everyone awake. Sarah rose and dressed quickly, the stiffness in her muscles a reminder of the fight. The day before, the training yard was already filled with recruits lined up in ranks, the air sharp and cold the sky above pale gray drill sergeants barked orders, pushing them into formations. But Korth was not among them. Instead, another officer announced a sudden field test alive. Mission simulation. They were herded into the transport bay, massive hangar doors opening to reveal sleek drop ships, waiting engines, humming with deep power. The recruits filed in under the watch of armed guards, and soon the dropships roared into the sky. The view, through the narrow windows, shifting from the Academy's towers to a sprawling wasteland of jagged rocks and dark sand. The simulation was to retrieve a beacon hidden deep within the terrain, while hostile drones and traps hunted them down. The ship touched down hard, dust blasting against the hull, and the door slid open. The recruits spilled out, weapons in hand, scanning the landscape. The air was heavy with heat waves, distorting the horizon. Sarah gripped her rifle, moving cautiously. With her assigned squad, 2 insectoid cadets and a tall, armored reptilian, they kept their distance from her, but she did not care. Her eyes stayed forward, her focus on the mission. The first trap came fast, a swarm of drone spheres rising from the sand, their surfaces gleaming under the harsh sun. They fired bursts of stun rounds, forcing the squad to dive for cover. Sarah rolled behind a rock, returning fire, each shot cracking through the air, aimed sharp and steady. One by one the drones dropped until the last fell smoking into the sand, but the reptilian gave her no thanks, only a brief glance before moving on. They were still not ready to trust the human. Hours passed under the sun, the team pushing deeper into the wasteland, the beacon signal growing stronger, but so did the enemy waves. The drones became faster, smarter, some camouflaging against the rocks, others diving from above. Sarah fought without hesitation, her movements clean, efficient, each pull of the trigger deliberate. Her squad began to notice. They stayed closer, now their eyes flicking to her when danger loomed, without words, forming an unspoken rhythm of survival. Finally, they reached the canyon where the beacon signal pulsed strongest, but the path was narrow, with high walls perfect for an ambush, and it came swiftly, turrets unfolding from the rock faces, spraying fire that forced them to scatter. Sarah saw the insectoid cadet on the left pinned down, unable to move. Without taking a direct hit, she dashed across the open ground, sliding into cover near the cadet, and firing upward at the turret. The burst hit home, and the weapon sparked, then fell silent. The cadet's eyes widened in surprise, but he followed her lead as they pushed forward. The beacon sat at the canyon's heart, a small black device emitting a faint blue glow, but between them and it stood the largest drone, yet a hulking bipedal machine armed with heavy cannons and a shield that shimmered like liquid metal. It stepped forward with a low mechanical growl, firing in bursts that shook the ground around them. Sarah knew this was not something they could fight head on, not without a plan. She shouted for the squad to split, drawing the machine's fire toward her, while the others circled to flank it. Bullets and energy bolts tore the ground at her feet, but she kept moving, darting between cover, firing at the joints in its legs, sparks flying from the impacts. The machine turned to track her, its shield dropping for a fraction of a second each time it attacked. That was the opening. The reptilian saw it and unleashed a barrage from the side. The shield flickered and fell, and Sarah charged forward, sliding under the machine's swing and planting a grenade against its exposed core. The blast ripped through the air, throwing her back into the dust. When the smoke cleared, the machine was a smoking wreck, and the beacon lay just beyond it. The squad retrieved it quickly. The mission complete, they signaled for extraction as the dropship descended, the wind whipping through the canyon on the ride back. No one spoke, but the silence was different now. There was no longer the cold edge of dismissal. Instead, there was the quiet of people processing what they had just witnessed. Back at the academy, the recruits were dismissed, but as Sarah stepped down from the transport, Korth stood, waiting, his massive frame blocking the path. For a moment, they stared at each other, the crowd, watching in tense silence. Korth's voice, when it came, was low, but it carried to everyone present. Cadet Sarah, human, you survived not because you were lucky, but because you fought like a soldier. It was not warm and it was not gentle, but it was recognition. And in this place that was more valuable than praise. He stepped aside and let her pass. And as she walked into the barracks, she heard the whispers starting again, but they sounded different now. They were saying her name not with doubt, but with weight. That night Sarah sat on her bunk, the sounds of the barracks fading into the background. She thought about how far she had come from the day she first arrived, from being the outsider, the weak link, to becoming someone they could not ignore. She knew more battles were coming, more trials, more chances to fall, but she also knew she would face them all head on, because she had earned something today, something that would last. And somewhere deep down, She felt the spark of something even greater, a thought that maybe one day, when the galaxy spoke of humans, they would remember this moment, the day one stubborn soldier refused to break and made them all see what humanity could do.